In September of 1968, three divers slipped into 18 feet of water off the northwest coast of North Bimini Island and found something that did not belong on a sandy Bahamian seafloor. Joseph Manson Valentine, a naturalist who had spent years studying the marine life of the Caribbean, was diving that day with the freediver Jacques Mayol and a third companion named Robert Angove. They were not searching for ruins. They were simply exploring a stretch of shallow water northwest of the island when the bottom changed beneath them. Where there should have been loose sand and scattered coral rubble, there was instead a run of large, flattened stones lying edge to edge in a long, deliberate line, stretching away into the murk in a direction that looked less like geology and more like intention. North Bimini sits about 50 miles east of Miami Beach, close enough that small planes and fast boats had been running between the two for years by 1968, close enough that the discovery reached the American press within days rather than fading as a regional curiosity confined to a remote island nobody could easily visit. The water on the bankside of the island runs shallow and startlingly clear, the kind of visibility that lets sunlight reach the seafloor in unbroken bands and makes a diver feel, more than in almost any other Caribbean location, as though they are flying rather than swimming. It was in exactly that kind of light that Valentine first noticed the change in the bottom, a shift from the soft, shifting sand he expected to something flat, angular, and still. The blocks were enormous. Some measured more than 13 feet across. They lay in rows, roughly rectangular, their corners softened by decades or centuries of tidal grinding, but still visible enough to suggest, at first glance, right angles that nature rarely produces on its own. The formation ran for roughly half a mile along a northeast to southwest line, and divers who followed it later found two smaller parallel tracks running close by, along with a section where the main line curved into something that resembled a hook. Valentine took photographs. Word spread fast, and it spread into a culture that was primed to receive it. 2 years before the discovery, in a set of readings given decades earlier and republished in the 1960s, the psychic Edgar Cayce had told his followers that remnants of the lost civilization of Atlantis would rise near Bimini sometime around 1968 or 1969. When Valentine's photographs surfaced that same year, showing exactly the kind of stonework that a temple road or harbor wall might leave behind, the timing did the rest. Newspapers ran the story. Believers flew to the island. What had been a regional curiosity became, almost overnight, the most famous piece of underwater rock in the Western Hemisphere. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The word Atlantis did not appear in this story by accident, and it is worth remembering where it came from before going any further. The only ancient source for the legend is Plato, writing around the year 360 before the Common Era in two dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias, where he described a wealthy island civilization that existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the strait at Gibraltar, and that sank into the sea in a single day and night after angering the gods. Plato placed the island in the Atlantic beyond the strait separating the Mediterranean from the open ocean, which put it, if his geography is read literally, thousands of miles from the Bahamas. Generations of writers have relocated Atlantis to nearly every coastline on Earth since then, from the Aegean to the Azores to the Canary Islands, and Cayce's readings, which placed a portion of it near Bimini, were simply the most recent and most specific of those relocations. None of that makes the underlying legend impossible to connect to any real event. Some historians have long suspected Plato's story was inspired, at some distance, by the catastrophic volcanic eruption that struck the Aegean island of Thera roughly 3,500 years ago and devastated the Minoan civilization on Crete. It does mean that treating a specific Caribbean rock formation as literal, physical proof of Plato's account requires stretching the original geography considerably, a point that skeptics of the Bimini identification have made since the earliest days of the controversy. What Valentine and his companions had actually found sits at the center of one of the longest-running disputes in American archaeology, and it is a dispute worth taking seriously precisely because both sides have real evidence and real credentials behind them. This was never a story about a hoax, Nobody faked the stones. They are exactly as large and as strangely arranged as the early photographs showed. The disagreement has always been about what put them there, and more than 5 decades of fieldwork have not fully closed that question for everyone, even though most geologists today believe they know the answer. To understand why the Bimini Formation looked so convincing to the people who first saw it, it helps to understand what the Bahamas looked like at the end of the last ice age. Sea level during that period sat well below where it stands today, low enough that much of the shallow bank around Bimini would have been exposed as dry land, crossed by tidal creeks and lined with beaches. Those ancient shorelines are not speculation. They are mapped, dated, and consistent with the broader record of how sea level rose across the Caribbean as the glaciers melted. A beach that existed thousands of years ago in that spot would sit, after the water came back, at roughly the depth where Valentine found his stones. Beaches like that produce a very specific kind of rock. It is called beachrock, and it forms in the intertidal zone when calcium-rich seawater percolates through loose sand, shells, and coral fragments and cements them together into a solid slab, usually while the beach is still exposed to air and sun. The process happens in layers, following the slope of the beach itself, which is why beachrock formations so often come out looking like tilted, parallel sheets rather than a random pile of stone. As the layers dry and shrink, and as wave action works on them over centuries, they crack along regular lines. Those cracks tend to run roughly perpendicular to each other, because that is how a drying, contracting slab of cemented sand naturally fractures. The result, after the joints widen and the corners round off underwater, can look remarkably like a row of quarried paving stones, especially to a diver seeing it for the first time through a mask, with visibility limited and imagination doing some of the work. That was the argument mounted by 2 researchers who took the question more seriously than almost anyone else who studied Bimini. Eugene Shinn, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, and John Gifford, an archaeologist at the University of Miami, spent years in the 1970s doing the unglamorous work that separates a real investigation from a rumor. They drilled core samples directly through the blocks, extracting cylinders of rock that showed the internal structure no surface photograph could reveal. What they found inside was not the uniform work stone of a constructed pavement. It was layered sediment, grain packed on grain in patterns consistent with natural deposition, the same internal fabric you would expect from beach rock that had formed in place rather than being cut and hauled from a quarry. They also looked for the kinds of evidence that would settle the question decisively if a human hand had shaped these stones. Tool marks, mortar or binding material between the blocks, any sign that the stones had been transported from somewhere else, since a road or wall built by people typically uses material that does not match the immediate surroundings. Shinn reported finding none of it. The composition of the Bimini blocks matched the beach rock exposed on nearby shorelines almost exactly. Radiocarbon dating of the material placed its formation somewhere between roughly 2,500 and 3,500 years ago. Later work pushed some cementation estimates further back still, and either figure sat far outside any timeline that would fit a lost advanced civilization on the scale that Plato originally described. Valentine did not accept the beach rock explanation quietly, and his objections deserve to be laid out fairly rather than waved away, because they are the ones that kept the debate alive among people who were not simply chasing a myth. He argued that a number of the stones were made of a harder, denser rock called micrite, rather than ordinary soft beach rock, that the blocks did not follow the gentle curving lines you would expect from a beach's natural contour, and that some of the largest slabs appeared to be propped at their corners on smaller supporting stones, arranged in a way that reminded him of the standing arrangement seen at dolmens in Europe, rather than lying flush the way a cracked, sagging natural slab typically would. He had spent 30 years studying the marine environment of the Bahamas before making the discovery, and he did not consider himself a fringe figure. He considered himself a scientist who had found something the beach rock model did not fully explain. The site kept drawing serious attention through the 1970s. Dmitry Rebikov, a French engineer and diver credited with pioneering work in underwater photography and the inventor of a towed underwater survey platform called Pegasus, spent nearly a decade, from 1969 to 1978, compiling a detailed stereoscopic photomosaic of the formation, mapping its full extent and documenting the small support stones that Valentine had pointed to. Rebikoff's mosaic became the closest thing the debate had to an agreed reference map, used by believers and skeptics alike whenever a new claim needed to be checked against the actual layout of the stones rather than against a diver's memory of what they thought they saw. His photographic record also documented, in more methodical detail than anyone before him, the way the formation's northeast to southwest line held its width and spacing, with a consistency that both camps have cited in support of opposite conclusions, proponents of a built origin pointing to the regularity as evidence of design, and geologists pointing to the same regularity as exactly what you would expect from a single beach terrace fracturing along consistent stress lines as it dried and settled over thousands of years. Around the same time, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the organization founded to preserve Edgar Cayce's readings, commissioned an English professor and expert diver named David Zink to lead a formal expedition to the site in the summer of 1975. Zink returned for repeated seasons afterward, eventually leading roughly 10 expeditions to Bimini over the following years, using side-scan sonar and material analysis alongside more conventional survey techniques. Not everything Zink brought back held up. His team recovered fragments of fluted marble near the formation that he initially described as ancient artifacts, consistent with a lost megalithic culture. Later analysis identified the marble as ship's ballast, ordinary stone, carried as weight in the hold of a much more recent vessel and discarded or lost near the site, with nothing to connect it to the road itself. Zink went on to describe the location as possessing what he called sacred geometry, comparing it to Stonehenge, and his later writing leaned increasingly on psychic testimony gathered through the Cayce organization to support the idea that the stones had been built by an advanced culture, at one point associating the site with visiting extraterrestrial influence drawn from readings rather than physical evidence. That turn cost him credibility with the scientific community and eventually cost him the backing of the very organization that had funded his early work. His own conclusion, stated more cautiously in his book on the subject, was that Bimini represented either a colony of Atlantis or a separate culture that existed alongside it, a position considerably softer than the confident claims that had circulated around his expeditions in the press. It was a notably hedged ending for someone who had spent the better part of a decade and 10 separate expeditions chasing a much bigger answer, and it reflects how little solid ground the site ultimately gave, even to a researcher who wanted very badly to find some. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The joints between the blocks told their own story too, and this is where the geological case has generally been strongest. On a genuine paved road or harbour wall, joints tend to be worked deliberately, often fitted with some care, because the builders wanted a stable, usable surface. The joints at Bimini varied widely in width and depth, ran in directions that shifted from one section of the formation to the next, and lined up with the kind of tension cracking you would expect from a slab curing and shrinking as a single unit, rather than from separate stones being placed one at a time. Later surveys extended the picture further. Divers mapping the wider area found more of these fractured, pavement-like formations elsewhere around Bimini and along other Bahamian shorelines, in spots with no legendary weight attached to them at all, no Cayce prophecy, no expedition looking for Atlantis. The pattern kept showing up wherever the right combination of ancient beach slope and geological history existed, which is exactly what you would expect from a natural process and considerably harder to explain if each occurrence required its own vanished civilization. Shinn laid out the strongest version of his case in an article published in the journal Nature, arguing from the core data itself rather than from general skepticism about lost civilizations. The British researcher Peter James, reviewing the controversy in a later book on ancient mysteries, summarized the core findings in terms that stuck with other writers on the subject. If the formation had been man-made, The internal grain structure inside each block should have varied from stone to stone, the way it would in separately quarried material, but the cores instead showed consistent internal fabric running across block boundaries, exactly what a single fractured slab would produce, alongside radiocarbonages on embedded shell material that clustered in the range of roughly 2,500 to 3,500 years, far short of the 11,000 years or more that a literal reading of Plato's account would require. That combination of a consistent internal fabric and a comparatively young radiocarbon age has done more to convince working geologists than any other single piece of evidence produced at the site, because it addresses the two most basic questions a skeptical scientist would ask, namely whether the stone was assembled from separate pieces and whether its age is compatible with the claim being made about it. By the end of the 1970s, the case for a natural geological origin was about as strong as this kind of field science gets, at least among professional geologists. It rested on drilled samples rather than surface impressions, on measured composition rather than photographs taken through a dive mask, and on a mechanism, beachrock formation, that geologists can watch happening on beaches around the world today. That did not end the argument. A writer named Greg Little published a detailed rebuttal of Shinn's conclusions in a magazine devoted to unexplained phenomena in 2006, and returned to the criticism again in a 2017 piece, arguing that Shinn's sampling had not adequately addressed the micrite stones or the propped corner supports that Valentine had originally described. Shinn, for his part, remained a committed skeptic of the artificial origin theory for the rest of his career, and continued writing about Bimini as an example of how a genuinely interesting natural formation can be transformed by circumstance and belief into something it was never meant to be. None of that fully ended the story, and it is worth sitting with why. Gavin Menzies, a former British submarine officer who built a career on unconventional readings of maritime history, argued that the Bimini Formation deserved a second look even within a non-Atlantean framework, suggesting it could represent the remains of a harbour structure built by a much later seafaring culture rather than a lost prehistoric civilization at all. Other researchers have pointed out, fairly, that a natural process producing a formation does not automatically rule out later human use of it. A ridge of naturally fractured beach rock lying in shallow water, running in a long straight line, would have been a plausible place for later peoples to build on, walk along, or use as a breakwater, and identifying that kind of secondary use in the archaeological record is a genuinely difficult problem, one that a single core sample cannot fully resolve. The counter-argument that no artifacts, no worked edges consistent with human modification beyond the disputed support stones, and no cultural material of any kind have ever turned up in direct association with the formation has held up so far in the mainstream literature, but the divers and researchers who keep returning to the site are not simply chasing a myth that professionals have already killed. They are working at the edge of what underwater geology can prove beyond doubt, in a location that keeps offering just enough ambiguity to reward another look. There is also a simpler reason the debate has never fully closed, and it has nothing to do with data. Standing on a boat above the formation, or watching aerial footage of it from a drone, the Bimini Road still looks exactly like what its name promises. The scale is difficult to convey in a still photograph. The blocks are large enough that a diver swimming alongside them looks small, and the line holds its shape for a genuinely long distance, curving at one end in a way that photographs from the 1970s captured, and that continues to draw comparisons to a harbor entrance or a processional way. Geology can explain every measurement taken from that formation and still not fully account for how convincing it looks to a human eye trained, by millions of years of pattern recognition, to notice straight lines and right angles and assume they mean somebody built something. That tension between measured evidence and visual impression runs through almost every case in this genre, and Bimini is simply the clearest example of it, because the evidence is unusually thorough and the visual impression is unusually strong at the same time. Most underwater mysteries fade because nobody bothers to core sample them, or because the photographs are too poor to sustain interest past the initial headline. Bimini got both a serious scientific investigation and a striking photogenic subject, and the result is a formation that professional geology considers settled, while amateur and semi-professional interest in it has never really slowed down. Documentary crews have returned to the site repeatedly since the original discovery, including a television special produced in 2006 that revisited the Atlantis question for a new audience, and dive operators on North Bimini still run regular trips out to the formation, and the debate resurfaces on a fairly predictable cycle whenever a new diver posts fresh footage online, footage that inevitably looks, to someone seeing it for the first time, exactly like Valentine's original photographs did. What makes the Cayce connection worth taking seriously as a piece of the story, even without endorsing the prophecy itself, is the specific mechanism by which belief and evidence interacted here. Cayce's prediction did not create the stones. The stones were there long before anyone made any prediction about them, sitting under a few feet of water since the sea rose over that ancient shoreline thousands of years ago. What the prediction did was supply a framework that made an ambiguous natural formation instantly legible as something else, and once that framework was in place, it proved remarkably resistant to being dislodged by data. People who wanted to believe the stones were built had, by 1968, already been told exactly where and roughly when to look for proof that Atlantis was real, and when Valentine's photographs appeared on schedule, the coincidence did more persuasive work than any single geological argument could undo. This is not a story about people being foolish. It is a story about how a genuinely strange-looking rock formation, discovered at a psychologically loaded moment, can outrun the science built specifically to explain it, simply because the explanation asks people to accept an origin that offers no mystery at all, while the alternative offers a great deal. The honest state of the evidence as it stands today is this. The core samples taken by Shinn and Gifford are real, and they show natural layering consistent with beachrock. The composition matches local rock rather than any imported quarried stone. The radiocarbon dates fall within a range that fits ordinary coastal geology and fits no serious timeline for a lost advanced civilization on the scale Plato described. No definitive artifacts and no undisputed cultural material have ever been recovered from the site in more than 50 years of diving and study, though the fluted marble episode shows how easily a stray object near a famous site can be mistaken for proof. Set against all of that is a formation that still, visually, looks for all the world like a road, curving at one end, running straight for half a mile, wide enough and regular enough, and marked by enough unresolved details in the joint patterns and support stones that dismissing it entirely as an accident of geology asks something of the eye that the mind resists. Most working geologists in this field consider the natural origin question closed and have for decades. The site itself, sitting quietly in shallow, warm, clear water off an island most people could not find on a map before 1968, has never quite gotten the message. North Bimini itself remains a small island, a few miles long, with an economy that has leaned for decades on sport fishing, a handful of resorts, and the steady trickle of divers who come specifically to see the formation for themselves rather than to fish the surrounding flats. Local dive operators list the Bimini Road as a standard shallow excursion, often paired with a trip to the nearby wreck sites and reef systems that make the island a popular stop for boats crossing over from Florida. The water at the site rarely exceeds 20 feet in depth, shallow enough that even snorkelers can look down and see the full sweep of the line without diving equipment at all, which has done as much as any book or documentary to keep the formation in circulation. A geological argument published in a journal reaches a few thousand specialists. A tourist's underwater video posted from a boat anchored over the stones reaches an audience that has never heard of core sampling and is not especially interested in it, and for that audience the formation still does exactly what it did to Valentine, Mayol, and Angove in 1968. Divers who visit Bimini today, whether they arrive convinced of Atlantis or convinced of Beachrock, tend to describe the same experience once they are actually in the water. The formation is larger than they expected. The blocks are more imposing up close than any photograph suggests, and swimming along the length of the northeast to southwest line, watching it curve gently at the far end, it is easy to understand exactly what three men felt in 1968 when they came across it for the first time and could not immediately explain what they were seeing. That feeling, more than any specific claim about Atlantis, is the real inheritance of the discovery, and it is probably the reason the site continues to draw visitors long after the scientific literature settled the underlying question to most researchers' satisfaction. Bimini is not the only site where this exact argument has played out. Off the coast of Yonaguni, one of Japan's southernmost islands, divers in the early 1990s found a large underwater rock formation with stepped, terraced surfaces and sharp, angular edges, and a similar split opened up almost immediately between a marine geologist named Masaaki Kimura, who has argued for decades that the structure shows signs of deliberate carving, and other geologists who maintain that the terracing is consistent with the way the local sandstone naturally fractures along its bedding planes and joint systems. The Yonaguni debate has never been resolved to the satisfaction of both sides any more than Bimini's has, and the two sites on opposite ends of the planet share the same underlying dynamic. A striking natural formation, discovered by chance divers rather than by a planned excavation, photographs in a way that reads as architecture to a general audience long before any core sample can be taken, and once that first impression sets, the subsequent scientific work is left arguing against a picture already fixed in the public imagination, rather than building understanding from a blank slate. There is a broader pattern here that extends well past one stretch of seafloor in the Bahamas. Coastlines around the world carry the record of sea levels that no longer exist, ancient beaches and river mouths and reef flats drowned by the same glacial melt that flooded Bimini's shoreline. Divers and fishermen occasionally stumble onto the geological remnants of those vanished coastlines, and because those remnants formed under conditions that sometimes produce straight lines, regular fractures, and orderly rows, they will keep looking, for a moment, like ruins. Most of the time, closer study resolves the question the way it resolved at Bimini, through core samples, dating, and composition analysis, rather than through photographs alone. Every so often, a genuinely ambiguous case survives that scrutiny longer than expected, and those are the ones that keep researchers coming back with drills and dating equipment rather than cameras. Bimini has mostly, though not entirely, moved past that stage. What remains genuinely contested is not so much whether Beachrock can explain most of the formation, since most geologists agree it can, but whether it explains all of it, including the harder micrite stones and the propped support corners that first caught Valentine's eye and that Shinn's critics have never stopped raising. That narrower disagreement between a settled majority view and a persistent minority one is a far more honest description of where the science actually stands than either the confident Atlantis narrative or a flat dismissal would suggest. The stones themselves, either way, are not going anywhere. They have sat under that water since long before anyone thought to look for Atlantis there, and they will likely sit there, drawing divers and skeptics and true believers in roughly equal numbers, long after every argument made about them today has been revisited by whoever studies the site next. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.